Welcome to everybody joining. We will give just a couple of minutes for people to filter through. We do have quite a lot of attendees today, and so I just want to give people a chance to get into the call. Thank you. Welcome everybody to the May VAMHN lunchtime webinar. We're delighted to have you with us. We've taken a couple of months break over March and April, and it's really good to be back here with you all today. If you haven't been to a Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network webinar before, perhaps you don't know very much about the VAMHN, and you were forwarded the invite by a colleague, then a special welcome to you today. The VAMHN are hosted out of King's College London, but we have members across the UK and indeed internationally. We work to try and reduce the prevalence of mental health problems among children, adults and the elderly by bringing together experts with different ways of thinking about violence, abuse and mental health, some with personal experience with these issues, others with expertise from the work that they do, and survivor researchers with both. And ultimately, we are hoping to understand, prevent and reduce the impact of violence and abuse on mental health. These lunchtime webinars are a really important part of our programming. We work to try and identify research and analysis from within the university sector, within the NGO sector, from independent researchers and also from government, to really bring you the latest in research and analysis on violence, abuse and mental health, with an emphasis on understanding the implications of those findings, whether that is for research, service or policy. So I'm absolutely delighted today to have Widanaralalage with us from King's College London, who's going to be talking about male survivors of sexual violence, silence, myths and institutional harm. Before I pass over to him, just a few points of housekeeping. We ask our speakers to talk for 20 to 25 minutes, so that leaves us with time at the end for questions. If I can ask you please to use the webinar chat to do introductions, hellos, to share resources. That's a really good resource for everybody to make use of. If you have a question that you would like to put to Ken, if you could put that in the Q&A box, please. We run these as webinars rather than meetings, which unfortunately means that you are all microphones off and cameras off. So I won't be able to come to you individually to ask a question, but I will be able to see all of the questions that come through on the Q&A box, and I will get through as many as I can. Any questions that I'm not able to get through today in the time that we have, I'll put to Ken and ask if he could provide an email response which we can share. Just to reassure you that we are recording the talk today, so we will be sharing the recording with you. We will also be sharing a PDF copy of the slides and some of the other resources that Ken has shared with us today. So lots of resources coming your way after today's talk, and we'll get those to you as soon as we can. So I'll hand over to Ken in just a second. He will be providing an overview of the types of abuse that men report, the psychological impacts of these experiences, and the support needs that often follows. And a key part of the talk will be focusing on the experiences of Black and Asian male survivors, with attention to how racialized stigma and cultural expectations further complicate disclosure and access to justice. We're absolutely thrilled to have you, Ken. Thank you for being with us today. I'm going to go camera off and hand over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the introduction, and also for having me here to present some of our research in this particular area. It's something that I've been working on since my PhD, and has become a really important part of my professional and also personal life, to be completely honest. The experience of talking to men about their experience of sexual violence is it's something incredibly personal, because men have some important barriers to overcome in the first place to feel comfortable in any setting, to be frank, particularly in a research setting, to talk about their experiences, often experiences that happened in childhood, in adolescence, but also in adulthood. So hopefully this talk will provide some new insight, or provide further knowledge around the type of challenges that men encounter from all backgrounds and ages, and can inspire potentially further research and new ways of thinking about your practice and even policy. So just a brief overview of what I'll be going over today. I'll discuss some ideas around the prevalence and challenges that men encounter in recognizing themselves as legitimate victims of sexual violence, and particularly looking into the stereotypes that exist around the male sexual violence, known as male rape myths, which is an extension of the traditional rape mythology that is typically discussed for female victims of sexual violence, and then looking into some of our work with survivors around the barriers that they've encountered to disclose their experiences and seek support, and looking into the lived experiences and direct quotes from the survivors I've interviewed over the years. And hopefully this can come together into a discussion of potential implication of how we can provide support for male survivors of sexual violence, and policy ideas and implications. When discussing and talking about male victims of sexual violence, is often one of the challenges that we have as researchers and then practitioners, is the number of misconceptions and false beliefs that we have around this phenomenon. The first key idea that it doesn't happen to men, that sexual violence is something that predominantly interests women and girls. And whilst it's absolutely true that the majority of victims are women and girls, there is a substantial number of men and boys who also report experience of sexual violence. And some data from charities suggest anywhere between 1 in 4 men and 1 in 6 boys having lifetime experiences of sexual violence. Data from the Office of National Statistics goes on to suggest that over 200,000 men in the space of a year's time have some experience of sexual violence after the age of 16. So as soon as we recognize that it's a very prevalent experience, the other challenge that we have to overcome are the stereotypes that we have around masculinity. Men are strong, resilient, and emotionally they're able to handle any experience. And the evidence is quite clear also in this domain. Men report all sorts of negative psychological experiences and serious mental health concerns following their experiences of abuse, from depression, anxiety, nightmares, flashbacks, and intrusive thoughts about the experiences. Men often report unhealthy levels of anger and aggression, but also very strong evaluative emotions like shame, guilt, embarrassment, and self-blame in particular for what has happened. Men also report, some men in particular report some sort of identity crisis relating to their sexuality and to their gender. So a very complex psychological profile that's not too dissimilar from what is reported by other victim groups. As soon as we recognize that it's prevalent, that we recognize that men are affected, that questions are raised around men's ability to cope with all of this. And the key men report quite consistently when discussing their experience of sexual violence struggles with recognizing themselves as legitimate victims of sexual violence and challenges around disclosing their experiences, seeking support, and accessing that support as well. One of the challenges that exists in the UK, but broadly speaking worldwide, is around the availability of resources for men. And in fact, what men tend to report is that there aren't enough resources for them, whether those mean charities or specialist mental health support that they can access and that they feel are appropriate for their unique needs. So this is a very brief overview of some of the backgrounds. And I wanted to just very briefly highlight some of the ideas and some of the myths that perhaps you also have encountered around male rape. They serve a very similar function to the myths that we found around female victims. So these are ideas like, oh, she dressed in a certain way, therefore she must have wanted it. All of these very false, very negative, very judgmental beliefs to victims that serve the function to exonerate perpetrators from the violence that they commit. These are similar for male rape myths, but are reinforced by specific ideas around masculinity and homophobia. So when we think about the strength that men are expected to have, we see myths such as real men cannot be raped or men are too strong to be raped. When we think about homophobia, then male rape myths serve the function to delegitimize the experiences of all male survivors and just limited to gay men. So only gay men are raped, or men who claim rape, they do so to hide their sexuality. And looking into the victim blaming type of myths, men who are raped ask for it, or that male rape is not traumatic. And then finally around the stereotypes and the contexts in which male rape is expected to occur. So only men in prison are raped, or only big strong men can rape other men. I'm sure that all of us can think back to examples in popular media of the jokes around all men dropping soaps in prison and being victims of sexual violence, and how these tropes are used to ridiculize the crime of sexual violence and portray an idea in which male rape is something almost absurd, anomalous, and that doesn't happen in quote unquote normal contexts. All of this together provide a clear picture of the culture that exists around not recognizing or not treating seriously enough male rape. And one of the consequences that hopefully the research highlights from some of the work that we've done is that survivors themselves are exposed to these myths and use these myths to make sense of their experiences. So in terms of what I've been trying to do in the last few years and some of the objectives that I have for my future work, I'm very much interested in understanding how men make sense of their experience of sexual victimization. And we do so by engaging in qualitative work, interviewing survivors directly from a variety of backgrounds and experiences. We're also very interested in better understanding what shapes disclosure and access to support. And we have conducted work around specific ethnic minority groups' experiences, and I'll be presenting some work from our South Asian studies and our Black survivor studies, really looking into this idea of intersectionality from a male survivor perspective, and so how do stigma around race, gender norms, and homophobia intersect to create the barriers for men to report their experiences and seek support. And some of our work also focuses on the experiences of service providers and professionals in working and supporting these communities. And so we conducted interviews with service providers to identify, in the most crude way, potentially gaps that they see in training, but most broadly speaking, around the challenges they have as part of a system, the mental health system and the criminal justice system, around providing tailored support and also navigating the challenges around criminal investigations that often survivors have to undergo as part of their reporting to the police. Let's start off from one of the first works I've done with survivors. The idea of "I didn't feel I was a victim" was a statement that one of the survivors told me pretty much at the beginning of one of our interviews, in which he was trying to convey to me how and why it took him 30 years to come to a conclusion that what happened in his teens was a sexually violent act. He almost described this idea of not seeing the reason why he should consider himself a victim, almost this stereotypical belief that sexual violence is something that only concerns women, and therefore not seeing himself as a legitimate victim. So the study is from, again, a qualitative study with men who had histories of rape and sexual abuse after the age of 13 in the UK. And a number of themes are quite predominant when talking to survivors about their experiences. And one of the key ideas is around the silence and the discomfort that society has around discussing sexual violence. So here is a quote: "Men don't like to hear about other guys getting fucked. It's a graphical, visceral experience." A key dominant experience for survivors was around negotiating their masculine identity and the stereotypes and norms that are attached to this masculinity identity around stoicism, so maintaining a complete and lack of emotionality and invulnerability. And many survivors, to do so, engaged in quite aggressive behaviors. This is a quote from a survivor who was telling me how after the event he would go out to town, drink quite a lot, excessively in his own words, and look out for fights. And he was describing this desire to find the biggest guy, the toughest guy he could find, and go to him and engage in very aggressive behavior. And he tried to explain this idea as an attempt to reestablish his masculinity. And so he said something along the lines of, "I will square up to you, even if you might knock me out. That shows to you and the world that you are tough and I am tough." So demonstrating and re-establishing the masculinity, a very key driver of how survivors engaged, or some survivors anyway, engage with their experiences post-event. Sadly, often survivors reported mockery and stigma from people who they tried to disclose to. And they would talk about how this is a quite sad quote, actually: "I've shared my experience of rape and people laughed. They asked if my rapist was good looking." A really damaging and very delegitimizing way of responding to a survivor, especially when we consider thinking about survivors of sexual violence more broadly, the challenges that they have to overcome in order to disclose their experiences. And upon disclosure, having people asking about the attractiveness of the perpetrator completely minimizes and trivializes their experiences. And that was an experience that many male survivors reported. In terms of accessing support, a lot of betrayal and a lot of disappointment came across from survivors, and years after, in some of the other works that we have done, it still comes across. Some survivors tried to access female-orientated services, and they would receive very negative responses, such as services essentially telling them that they are primarily focused on women and that they are focused on women because the crimes are committed by men, which is, of course, a true statement, but felt for many survivors as a delegitimizing their experience or as a confirmation that they are seen as an afterthought in the service provision settings. The victim blaming and betrayal that has been experienced by male survivors from the police was also a very dominant theme in their experiences. Often survivors reported how they were made to feel guilty upon reporting, guilty until proven innocent. You doubt your own decisions. They made me feel like I was wrong and I potentially ruined someone else's life. Similarly, some survivors attempted to report to the police immediately after the event. And again, this is a direct quote. "I told the police straight away, crying, covered in dirt. Some guy just raped me. I don't know what to do." And the officer's responses was, "Oh, just go home and sober up." Hopefully, this really highlights how the reactions of institution can be a very powerful in making survivors feel delegitimized and having their experience ridiculed and trivialized, and how that had very negative consequences in the long term, particularly when they engage with therapy, which is something that we'll examine in a few slides. It's important to then this body of work that I just discussed primarily focused on and intentionally ended up being a study that focused on British white survivors of sexual violence. And it became apparent upon reading more about the cultural dimensions and the cultural stigmas and taking an intersectional feminist approach to studying sexual violence, the importance of potentially exploring and trying to have a better understanding of ethnic minority groups. And this is part of our current body of work. I can present today some work from the South Asian survivors. We have data from also Black survivors of sexual violence that's currently under preparation for submission. And when talking to ethnic minority groups around their experiences, whilst there are strong similarities in terms of the silence, the mockery, the masculinity dimensions, the need to and the barriers to report to institutions, the connotations around silence are very different. One of the survivors told me about this idea that they don't talk about sexual violence around here. It's not something that is openly discussed. Sex and mental health are a conversation that among the South Asian community are not openly addressed because of cultural motives around secrecy and honor and shame that are very dominant. So in this first quote around the family honor and shame, one of the survivors disclosed to his mother. And upon the disclosure, rather than having what he expected to be a very supportive and welcoming response, what he received was a very negative and a push towards silencing the experience so that the surrounding community wouldn't find out. If this comes out, what it's going to achieve? What are people going to say? He's apologized. What are you going to get from speaking up about it now? This also highlighted a very important aspect of the type of violence that South Asian men have experienced in the UK, which is often from the community or from the family, which adds several layers of complexity when it comes to disclosing, because the community, as described by these survivors, have a tendency to be very close-knitted and to try and avoid external involvement, such as from the criminal justice system or from social services. All of this is underpinned by the series of taboos on sex and mental health that exist in ethnic minority communities, such as the South Asian community. Sex was never really spoken about, and it was always associated with shame. And so growing up, I never even considered the idea that I could have been vulnerable to sexual victimization. All of these ideas are underpinned by, quite similar to the white survivors, the idea of dismissal and silencing of experiences. But the key difference is how much families are involved in this process of silencing and making sexual violence a taboo amongst male survivors from South Asian communities. My family never took me seriously. They always took me for a kid who was being rebellious. Even today, my parents just constantly tell me to get over it. Again, highlighting how sexual violence, when experienced by men, is trivialized as something that men, because of the stereotypes that we have around masculinity, which are particularly strong in South Asian communities, are expected to be strong, to be resilient, and therefore move on and stop dwelling over these particular experiences, which, as we can all imagine, is challenging and potentially worsen the survivor's ability to build resilience and to make sense of their traumatic experiences. In terms of Drawing parallels with white survivors' experience of seeking support, the lack of resources were dominating survivors' experiences, and the distrust in the criminal justice system was also very similar. What's different is perhaps how South Asian survivors were often very interested in finding culturally competent mental health support for a variety of reasons. Seeking mental health in South Asian community is something shameful because of the taboos around mental health and sex, and therefore survivors describe going to therapy as going undercover to seek support. It would be like me going undercover to go have therapy and then coming back and trying to fake my emotions. It's honestly hard and it's exhausting. Inside, you are just broken. Relatedly, when it came to the distrust in the system, some survivors from South Asian community did report and reported against their own families, and the responses that they received were very negative. And particularly for cases that were prolonged cases of abuse. So this particular quote in the center of the slide describes a survivor who had been reported and had been flagged by social services and by the school as a case of risk. And upon reporting, the police arrives to the domestic setting, and the reaction that they have is around asking the survivor to just calm down and not taking the report very seriously and not taking the investigation any further. So just imagine you're a police officer. I'm telling you I was physically assaulted. There's a sexual abuse case going on, and you basically just tell me to change my clothes and go for a walk, and they get away with everything. I wanted to highlight briefly this idea of culturally competent support, because what survivors encountered in their experiences working with mental health services was ideas and suggestions and recommendations that just didn't match with their culture. For example, why counselor is never going to understand the dynamics of a BAME family. They say just cut off your parents. And this suggestion just doesn't work with South Asian culture, which are often very, very much closely knitted and very much with families often living together, different generations of families living together. And so this idea of cultural competence became very dominant in South Asian male survivors' accounts of seeking support. Briefly, I wanted to also highlight some of our work with service providers. Once we interviewed victims and survivors, it's always interesting to have the perspective of the practitioners, specialist practitioners in particular, who provide specific support for male survivors, because they can provide a very unique insight into the challenges that they encounter when supporting male survivors. And this idea of regaining masculinity was something that also dominated the accounts of service provider. And the type of therapeutic challenge that represented is that service providers have to work with the shame, expectations of control, and limited emotional expression that survivors seem to have upon starting their therapeutic journeys. Another challenge that service providers encounters are male rape myths. And so if on one hand survivors experience male rape myths, they also use them to make sense of their experiences. And so what service providers and practitioners end up doing is navigating these myths and help survivors unravel the myths to make them understand what are false beliefs, what are stereotypes, and how they're using these stereotypes to rationalize their experiences. So ideas around masculinity, ideas around the self-blame, challenges around their sexual identity and gender identity. Finally, and something of interest, I think, especially for those who are practitioners here today, is the type how service providers navigate the institutional harm and mistrust that survivors had upon starting their therapeutic journeys. Often, service providers are present throughout many of the interviewees in this study were independent sexual violence advisors, and they had to navigate complex investigative journeys, and often cases being dropped or cases that didn't reach the threshold to be referred to the Crown Prosecution Service, which created really strong sense of betrayal for survivors, and service providers' challenges augmented in that sense, because then they have to almost rebuild survivors' trust into society and into the journeys that they just started. quite a lot of studies and quite a lot of work covered. Hopefully, some of it makes sense. But if I had some key conclusions to highlight, is perhaps to recognize that male survivors face quite distinct and quite unique challenges, and that the barriers that they encounter are under-recognized. And there is a lot of work that needs to be done, both in terms of policy, when it comes to embedding gender and culture competent training, and expanding the type of services that are available for men. And there are several opportunities for future research in terms of the trajectory in the criminal justice system and the NHS as well, and also exploring other racialized minorities and LGBTQ plus survivors. If I can highlight a final point, is one of the challenges and one of the questions that it's often raised to me is around whether focusing on male survivors could end up taking away resources from other victim groups. But hopefully what some of our work is highlighting is that the barriers and challenges that are encountered by male survivors are the result of the environment in which we live in, and the underfunding of criminal justice system services, the underfunding of mental health support services. And so some of the challenges and some of the ways in which we can address the barriers that male survivors encounter would benefit all survivors groups. And so inclusivity may also be about this, about recognizing that many different groups in our society experience sexual violence, and that there's a lot that we can do to improve their access and make them feel a little bit more welcome in our society. And so, well, thank you very much for today. And here's some of my contact links. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken, for such an interesting and important presentation, really, really clearly conveyed for our group. We do have questions coming through, so I'm gonna jump straight in. Have you observed any promising models of service provision, either domestically or internationally, that better meet the needs of male survivors?
There's so the Male Survivor Partnership, which I believe still exists as an umbrella organization, has developed a very clear pathway of key domains of how to provide support to male survivors. And there are really, really important and well-documented organizations across the UK who do fantastic work with male survivors, and who also have facilitated the recruitment of some of the participants here that I described and discussed today. So if there were services that you're interested in looking into, Survivors Manchester, it's a great organization. Survivors UK here in London. There are really strong organizations in Brighton who do great work. And all of these organizations are underpinned by two key ideas. One being male survivor centered and focusing on the needs of men, and so not applying models that have been typically used to work with female survivors, because these models under-recognize the uniqueness of the environment in which male survivors experience sexual abuse, which is an environment in which toxic masculinity and homophobia exist. And by recognizing the stigma that exists around men having open conversations around mental health and sex, uh, that helps develop tools and develop frameworks that are more tailored towards their unique needs. And then the second point is around, and it's related, of course, to being male survivor centric, is around the type of therapeutic approaches that are used. There is a stronger emphasis in group settings. There is a stronger emphasis on psychoeducation as a pathway to developing the emotional language to describe own emotions. One of the dominant ideas is around lack of lack is it's a horrible way of phrasing it, the limits that are imposed to men in terms of describing own emotions and making sense of our own emotions. And so training and therapy that is centered around developing the toolkits to recognize their emotions, recognizing coping behaviors, and implement new strategies is something that underpins a lot of these organizations.
That's great. Thank you, Kennath. Such a comprehensive answer. A lot of our question here, a lot of our clients struggle with the thoughts around erection or ejaculation when sexually assaulted, even when we discuss it with them as it being a physiological reaction, not that they are actually aroused, enjoyed it, or had any consenting part in it. We obviously work with them to understand this from a physiological perspective and taking away the shame or guilt they felt. But do you have any other ideas about how to address this myth?
It's one of the most difficult ones to address because it's so counterintuitive for men and from society at large to make sense of. We often associate erections and ejaculations as indicators of sexual pleasure. However, the literature is also clear from a variety of sciences, not only from psychology but also from the animal sciences as well, and biological sciences as well, how these are fear reactions and paralysis reactions that are documented across a variety of species, not just humans themselves. And so the how to dispel this myth with clients is something that's probably going to be uniquely related to the therapeutic alliance that one establish with the clients, and this approach and this focus on psychoeducation, which must involve also a potentially detailed discussion as to how these experiences are nothing to do with sexual pleasure, and highlighting also, and this is why the psychoeducation component is important, what emotions do you attach to this experience? Do you attach pleasure, or do you attach all of this fear, all of this shame, all of this guilt that you feel relating to your experience of an erection, ejaculation, whatever it is? Self-blame is a very dominant experience amongst male survivors because it's easier to blame yourself rather than to admit that there was a moment in your life in which you did not have that masculine control and agency in your life to avoid and protect yourself from sexual violence, which is what typically is pushed against victims. If there was a recommendation I could make, is that often survivors talk about how group settings are really, really powerful, and knowing that other male survivors had experiences of quote unquote pleasure or erections or arousal, and how they worked through their trauma, it's a very powerful way for survivors to normalize their experiences. But I completely appreciate how challenging that is in practice, especially because you have to rebuild a lot of trust that has been destroyed by their experience of sexual violence.
Thank you. Another question. As a male survivor in therapy for decades, I always found services more accessible and effective in all gender services. Have you looked at this service provision sector in your research?
Sorry, what the services?
All
I missed that.
gender services.
Old or all?
All, ALL, all. It's my northern accent.
Okay, sorry. All gender services. That's a very interesting point and experience, as something that I didn't come across specifically. I worked with sexual assault referral centers and male specialist support services, and often I think maybe I didn't make my point. It didn't come across correctly. It's not that I don't think there are services out there who explicitly antagonize male survivors. It's just that the framing that many of these services have around centering their experiences around female survivors has resulted in some, or at least the men who I have encountered, to feel ostracized almost, and not able to what's the word, to feel welcome and to feel like they were in the right place. And it was until they entered the specialist male support service that they felt supported. But that's a very interesting point, and I think it's just giving me a new idea of something else to research a little bit more closely, which is the experiences of more all gender service providers and their approach to support.
Okay, thank you. And then I've got a number of questions that are kind of coming at this similar points. I'm going to try and group them together. So some questions around trying to understand the variety of experiences of male victims of sexual violence. So for example, if a man is forced into penetrating someone else, is this rape? When the victim of sexual violence is assigned male at birth, what is the share of perpetrators that are men versus women? And are male survivors' experiences different when the perpetrator is a woman versus a man? Quite a few questions within that bundle there.
In terms of, so I think the overarching theme of the question is around the gender of, or the sort of the sexual identity of the perpetrator and how that interacts with the type of experiences, shared and unshared experiences. So legally, a female perpetrator is not classed. It doesn't does in the UK does not fall under rape, because in the UK the penis needs to be present in the act. Now, there are a very strong body. There is a very big and vocal body of researchers who are strongly against this idea, because they recognize that being forced to penetrate can be incredibly traumatic for survivors, and this legal caveat is an anomaly in the in the English speaking world. Canada doesn't have it, the US doesn't have it, Australia doesn't have it either. So it's something that's very unique to the UK, and I can recommend Siobhan Ware as a very key author in this particular space, in the forced to penetrate sexual violence space in the UK. In terms of the shared experiences, in the uniqueness of the experiences, when the perpetrator is a woman, there are even further barriers for survivors, and there are even further stigmas. Men are expected to desire and to seek out sexual interactions with other women, and so even when talking about the fact that they have been abused by a woman, the reaction that men encounter is almost one of, well, it's not really sexual violence, because a woman cannot rape a man. A man always wants to have sex. A man couldn't have an erection if they want, or if they were not sexually aroused. So really feeding into a lot of the myths and stereotypes around masculinity and sexuality, and the way in which women cannot be seen only as victims and not as perpetrators. This has a number of repercussions. Into the recognition of male victims of female perpetrated sexual violence, and it makes it very difficult for us to give any appropriate estimate of how frequent it is. Some work suggests that, so some work from the States suggested around 10%, 13% of men have reported an unwanted sexual experience with a woman. Does that mean that involved made to penetrate or forced to penetrate? It's not entirely clear, especially because now the US is removing all of that data because of current political decisions. So we are a little unclear of the exact numbers, but it's definitely prevalent, and it is incredibly traumatic, equally traumatic as being or both being penetrated by a man or being forced to penetrate a woman or another man. I've given a very confusing answer. I appreciate that, but because it's a very confusing area of research, if that makes sense.
I don't think that was a confusing answer, Ken.
Okay.
It was very nuanced, and I appreciate that. We are coming to the end now of our 45 minutes always go so quickly. There were a couple of questions that I didn't manage to get through. I will pass those. They were both to do with, actually I can ask you to do a yes or no answer on this, Ken. I'm undertaking research on support for older survivors of sexual violence. Did you encounter any survivors over 60 in your work?
Yes.
Yes. Were there any trans men included in the study?
No.
No. Lovely. Right. Thank you. So that has quick fire responses to those two questions. If either of those people who submitted those questions would like to speak with Ken in more detail about those questions, I'm sure Ken would be happy to be contacted via email. Lots more questions that we could have asked, but sadly didn't have time to get through. So thank you again, everybody, for being with us here today. I hope you will join us for our next webinar, which will be held on June 18th. That is our rescheduled talk with Dr. Emma Yap from the University of Bristol, who will be talking about their work, normal trauma and abnormal diagnosis, the role of mental health evidence in sexual violence trials. The link is there in the chat. And is also on our website and newsletter. If you don't currently receive our newsletter, do go to our website to sign up to that. It comes out once a month and has all of the details of our events, news and updates from across the sector, funding, job opportunities, and much more. So do take a look at that if you don't already get it. Do come back in June for our next one. And thank you so much again, Ken, for such a wonderful presentation today. You've been fabulous and we're grateful
Thank
to
you so
have
much.
you.